The message came through just as I was finalizing the wedding menu with my mom. It was sharp, unrelenting. "You'll never outshine me." I'd told her years ago that I would always come first, and now she could watch from the sidelines while I took the lead. I stared at my phone, fingers hovering above the screen, the words blurry for a brief moment before sharpening into focus. There it was. Abigail, my best friend since childhood, had done it. She had taken my fiancé, my venue, my wedding date, and even the floral arrangements I had spent months choosing. What was meant to be my special day in 4 weeks would now be hers. I didn't let a single emotion show. No shock, no anger. My mother, sitting across from me with a catering brochure, looked up at me with a curious expression. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice gentle. I met her gaze with a smile that could have fooled anyone. "Absolutely," I said, offering nothing more. She returned to her notes, completely unaware that my entire world had just come crashing down. Looking back, the warning signs had been there all along. Abigail had always been competitive, but not in the healthy, motivating way. She thrived only when others lost, when she could claim victory over someone else. It began in our childhood, her need for perfect grades, all the attention, the flawless image. But even then, I never imagined she'd take it this far. I should have noticed the shift months ago. That's when Abigail suddenly became overly invested in every little detail of my wedding. She insisted on helping with the venue selection, constantly pushed to accompany me to dress fittings, and expressed excitement about every decision I made with an energy that, in hindsight, seemed too eager. And then there were the small, subtle moments, the way she looked at Lucas. At first, it was nothing overt, just a lingering glance here, a playful touch there, things that seemed harmless. But with time, those moments started adding up. 2 weeks ago, Lucas had been distant. He canceled our date nights, avoided any talk of the wedding, and seemed to bury himself in work. I brushed it off, thinking it was just typical pre-wedding nerves. But then he disappeared. No explanation, no breakup talk, just complete silence. I called. No answer. I texted. Nothing. And now, here was Abigail, basking in what she thought was her victory. I should have been furious, devastated, embarrassed, but I wasn't. I felt calm. Abigail believed she had won. She thought she'd taken everything from me, my fiancé, my future, my happiness. What she didn't know, what neither of them realized, was that I never lose. While she was celebrating her stolen engagement, I had already started making my own plans. I took a deep breath, steadying my thoughts before I typed my reply. Enjoy. A simple, unassuming word that meant little in the moment, but in 4 weeks, on her wedding day, she'd understand exactly what I meant. I tucked my phone away and grabbed a catering brochure, pretending to listen as my mother continued discussing the options, completely oblivious to what had just happened. Abigail had taken everything from me, but now the tables were about to turn. I wasn't going to steal anything from her. No, I just had to let her own decisions be her downfall. The days after Abigail's message passed quietly. Lucas never contacted me, and Abigail never gloatingly came back to rub it in. It was as if, in her mind, I had already faded into irrelevance, the woman who had lost. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't broken. I was waiting. I didn't shed a tear. I didn't lash out. Not once did I allow even the faintest sign of vulnerability to show. Instead, I did exactly what Abigail expected. Nothing. But sometimes, the best revenge doesn't require a single action. The most devastating move is to let someone walk right into their own disaster, and Abigail had no idea she was about to step straight into mine. A week later, a beautiful, gold-embossed envelope was hand-delivered to my door. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Abigail's. I slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the thick, elegant invitation. The text read, "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Abigail Carter and Lucas Wright, to be held on the 14th of June at the Magnolia Estate." It was my venue, my wedding date. She had stolen everything, and now she had the audacity to invite me. The sheer arrogance of it made my blood boil, but the ridiculousness of her pettiness almost made me laugh. That's when it hit me. I had already won, even before the real game had begun. Because people who are truly secure in their victories don't need an audience. Abigail wanted me there, not to celebrate, but to watch. She needed to see my pain, my humiliation, to feed off of it. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I RSVP'd. Wouldn't miss it. Can't wait to see everyone there. What Abigail hadn't taken into account was the guest list. The Magnolia Estate required every couple to confirm their final guest list 3 weeks before the wedding. Since Abigail had taken over my reservation last minute, she hadn't had the time, or the sense, to change it. And neither had I. Every person on that list, the people I loved, my family, my childhood friends, even Lucas's parents who adored me, was still invited. The only person on her side, herself. In just a few short weeks, Abigail would realize her mistake. Nothing ruins a bride's big day quite like realizing that every single guest in the room is secretly rooting for someone else. The final sign that Abigail was blind to her own downfall came the day of her dress fitting. A mutual friend, Olivia, invited me for coffee that morning. She was doing her best to keep her expression neutral. "You heard about Abigail's dress appointment today, right?" she asked, stirring her latte carefully. I took a sip of my tea and nodded. "Yes, I heard. She invited a few of us to join her. How generous," I replied smoothly. Olivia hesitated, then whispered, "She was wearing your dress." I didn't flinch. I didn't show a single ounce of surprise. Of course she was. She had taken everything else. Why wouldn't she wear the very dress I had picked for myself? But what Abigail didn't realize was the difference between us. I didn't need a dress to steal the spotlight. Abigail thought she was the center of attention, but what she didn't realize was that she was just another player in my story. In just 3 weeks, she would learn that the role she thought she was playing was never hers to claim. The morning of June 14th was bright and warm, the kind of perfect summer day that every bride dreams of. Abigail must have felt untouchable, surrounded by her hairdressers and makeup artists, basking in the glow of what she believed was her victory. She had stolen my wedding, my fiancé, my venue, everything I'd spent months planning. But what she didn't understand was that this day was never hers to take. It was always mine, and now it was time for the final act. I arrived early, stepping out of my car just as the first few guests began trickling in. The estate was breathtaking, exactly as I had envisioned it when I booked it nearly a year ago. The floral arch, the elegant white chairs, the candlelit reception hall, it was all my choice. Abigail had managed to keep everything except for one thing, the guest list. I watched as the first few guests approached the check-in table, friends I had known for years, family members who had supported me through everything. I could see their hesitation, their uncertain glances at the wedding program, which had Abigail and Lucas's names printed in gold. Whispers started almost immediately. "Isn't this supposed to be her wedding?" someone asked. They took her venue and her date. The murmurs spread like wildfire, catching like a spark in dry grass. Then Lucas's parents arrived. His mother, Dorothy, had never been subtle about her dislike of Abigail. She had always adored me, always said I was the kind of woman Lucas needed, level-headed, kind, and strong. The moment she saw me standing there, composed and smiling, something in her expression shifted. She walked toward me, her face softening. "Sweetheart," she said, taking my hands in hers. "What are you doing here?" I tilted my head slightly, my smile never faltering. I was invited. Her mouth parted in surprise before her gaze hardened. She turned toward the check-in table, her voice carrying through the courtyard. "Where's my son?" she demanded. A tense silence fell over the guests. It had begun. Inside the bridal suite, Abigail was sipping champagne, surrounded by her bridesmaids, or what was left of them. A few of them had already sent me quiet, apologetic texts, acknowledging their part in this mess, but I didn't need their loyalty. I had patience. As she checked her phone, Abigail finally noticed the flood of messages coming in. "Hannah, Abigail, did you know that 90% of your guests are her family and friends? Megan, you invited Lucas's parents, right? They don't look happy." And then, from Lucas himself, "We need to talk. Now." Abigail's champagne flute slipped from her hand, spilling over her silk robe. "What the hell?" she muttered. Outside, Lucas was pacing near the altar, running his hands through his hair, looking visibly agitated. Something was wrong. He had expected celebration, happiness, excitement, but instead, he was met with awkward silences and pointed stares. His best man, Ethan, pulled him aside. "Dude, did you even look at the guest list?" Ethan whispered. "This isn't a wedding, it's an execution." Lucas frowned, confused. Ethan handed him a printed copy of the guest list. Lucas scanned the names, recognition dawning slowly, and then horror. "These are all her people?" His throat went dry. "These are her people." Abigail had been so fixated on stealing my wedding that she hadn't bothered to make it her own. She had walked straight into my world, my circle, my legacy. Lucas looked around again, realizing that no one here was really there for them. The guests weren't celebrating them. They were watching, waiting. And then he saw me, standing at the back of the room in an elegant dress, calm and collected. His stomach twisted. She came. She RSVP'd. Ethan reminded him. She came. Abigail had been too busy being smug to question the invitation. But Lucas could feel the weight of his mistake bearing down on him. Was he a pawn in her game? His stomach churned. He needed to see Abigail now. Lucas stormed into the bridal suite without knocking. Abigail looked up, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and nerves. "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to see me before. Did you even look at the guest list?" He cut her off, his voice sharp. Abigail blinked, taken aback. He shoved the paper into her hands. "They're here for her, Abigail, not us." She skimmed the list, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper, her face drained of color. She'd been so consumed by stealing my wedding that she hadn't realized she'd stolen my audience too. Panic flickered across her face. This wasn't her moment, it was mine. "Who cares?" She forced a laugh. "It's still our wedding. They'll celebrate for us? Lucas didn't look convinced, because now everything made sense. The stolen wedding, the forced engagement, the guests who weren't really their guests. The realization hit him all at once. He had been a pawn in her game. Abigail reached out for him, but he stepped back. "I need a minute," he muttered. She watched, speechless, as he walked out. In the silence that followed, Abigail finally realized she might have been wearing the dress, but I was the one in control. The one thing Abigail should have changed was the guest list. I watched as the first guests approached the check-in table. Friends I had known for years, family who had supported me through thick and thin. I could see the hesitation in their eyes as they glanced at the wedding program, where Abigail and Lucas's names were printed in gold. The whispers began almost immediately. "Isn't this supposed to be her wedding?" One guest murmured. They took her venue and her date. The whispers spread quickly, like wildfire. Then Lucas's parents arrived. His mother, Dorothy, had never been shy about her dislike for Abigail. She'd always adored me, had always said I was the kind of woman Lucas needed, level-headed, kind, strong. As soon as she spotted me standing there, calm and smiling, something in her expression shifted. She walked toward me, taking my hands in hers. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle, "what are you doing here?" I tilted my head slightly, my smile never faltering. "I was invited." Her mouth parted in surprise, but her expression hardened almost immediately. She turned toward the check-in table, her voice loud and clear, carrying across the courtyard. "Where is my son?" A heavy silence settled over the guests. It had begun. Inside the bridal suite, Abigail was sipping champagne, surrounded by her bridesmaids, or what was left of them. A few had already texted me quiet apologies for being part of the mess, but I didn't need their loyalty. I had patience. As she checked her phone, Abigail finally noticed the flood of messages coming in. "Hannah, Abigail, did you know that 90% of your guests are her family and friends?" "Megan, you invited Lucas's parents, right? They don't look happy." And then, from Lucas, "We need to talk. Now." Abigail's champagne flute slipped from her hand, spilling over her silk robe. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath. Outside, Lucas was pacing near the altar, his hands running through his hair. Something was off. He had expected happiness, celebration, excitement, but instead, he was surrounded by awkward silences and questioning glances. His best man, Ethan, pulled him aside. Dude, did you even look at the guest list? Ethan whispered. This isn't a wedding, it's an execution. Lucas frowned, confused. What are you talking about? Ethan handed him the printed guest list. Lucas scanned the names, recognition dawning slowly, and then horror. These are all her people? His throat went dry. These are her people. Abigail had been so fixated on stealing my wedding that she hadn't bothered to make it her own. She had walked straight into my world, my circle, my legacy. Lucas looked around again, finally realizing that no one was really here for them. The guests weren't celebrating them. They were watching, waiting. Then he saw me, standing at the back of the room in an elegant dress, calm and composed. He swallowed hard. She came. She RSVP'd. Ethan reminded him. She came. Abigail had been so consumed by her smugness that she hadn't bothered to question it. Now, Lucas suddenly felt suffocated by the weight of the situation. Had this all been a mistake? Had he been played? His stomach twisted. He needed to see Abigail now. Lucas stormed into the bridal suite without knocking. Abigail turned, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and nerves. What are you doing here? You're not supposed to see me before. Did you even look at the guest list? He cut her off, his voice sharp. Abigail blinked, taken aback. He shoved the paper into her hands. They're here for her, Abigail, not us. She skimmed the list, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. Her face drained of color. She had been so consumed by stealing my wedding that she hadn't realized she had stolen my audience too. Panic flickered in her eyes. This wasn't her moment. It was mine. Who cares? She forced a laugh. It's still our wedding. They'll celebrate for us. Lucas didn't look convinced, because now he understood. The stolen wedding, the forced engagement, the guests who weren't really theirs. The truth hit him all at once. He had been nothing more than a pawn in her game. Abigail reached out for him, but he stepped back. I need a minute, he muttered. She watched, speechless, as he walked out. In the silence that followed, Abigail finally realized she might have been wearing the dress, but I was the one in control. As the ceremony time approached, Abigail stood near the grand doors of the estate, clutching her bouquet so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The guests whispered amongst themselves, exchanging glances. Lucas still hadn't returned, and her perfect day was crumbling before it even began. As I sat with my champagne, watching the scene unfold, I couldn't help but think back to her message from weeks ago. You'll never outshine me. Oh, Abigail, I never needed to outshine you. I just needed to let you fall into your own trap. The minutes ticked by slowly, suffocatingly. The guests shifted awkwardly in their seats, the whispers growing louder. The ceremony was supposed to start 20 minutes ago, but there was no groom at the altar. No music, no Abigail. She was still inside, standing near the grand doors, her grip on the bouquet so tight it seemed like it might snap in her hands. Lucas hadn't returned, and her perfectly stolen wedding was falling apart before it even began. I was exactly where I needed to be, watching. Abigail's maid of honor, Grace, hesitantly approached her. Abigail, maybe we should— No! Abigail's voice was sharp, panicked. He's just nervous. He'll be back. Grace bit her lip. It's been nearly half an hour. Abigail's breath was uneven. He'll come. But even she wasn't convinced anymore. The guests knew. Lucas's mother knew. I knew. And most importantly, Lucas knew. He had finally seen through her. While Abigail stood frozen inside, Lucas was outside, pacing near the estate's fountain, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened. His father stood beside him, arms crossed. This is a disaster, Lucas muttered, running a hand through his hair. His father exhaled deeply. No, son, this is a lesson. Lucas frowned. What's that supposed to mean? His father's gaze was firm. You left a strong, intelligent woman for a childish game of one-upmanship. And now, you're realizing what everyone else saw months ago. Lucas swallowed hard. I don't look around, Lucas's father said, his voice cutting through the tension. Do you see a single person here who's actually happy for you? Or is everyone just waiting for the inevitable? Lucas's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to argue, to deny what his father was saying, but he couldn't, because his father was right. Inside, everything was falling apart. First, it was Lucas's aunt and uncle, the first to stand up and leave their seats, slipping away quietly. Then, one by one, a few more guests followed suit. By the time Lucas's mother stood up, turned to her husband, and loudly declared, "We should go. There's no wedding happening today." It was undeniable. It was over. Like a chain of falling dominoes, the exodus began. The guests rose from their chairs, leaving in a steady stream. Abigail watched in stunned silence, unable to do anything to stop it. Her perfect day, her so-called revenge, was slipping right through her fingers. She snapped. With a violent motion, she threw the bouquet to the floor, her heels clicking furiously against the polished estate floors as she stormed through the building. Lucas still hadn't returned to the altar. Fine, Abigail thought. She'd find him herself. Her eyes locked onto him near the fountain, standing silently with his father. She marched straight toward him, ignoring the stares from the few remaining guests. Her voice was loud, panicked. "What the hell are you doing? Get inside!" Lucas turned slowly, his expression blank. Abigail's breath hitched. He looked different, not uncertain, not guilty, just done. "Lucas?" She tried again, softer this time, her voice trembling. "I know this is overwhelming, but—" "No," he interrupted, his voice calm, resolute. "I'm done." Her face twisted with disbelief. "You don't mean that." Lucas exhaled, steadying himself before pulling off his ring. "I do." And just like that, it was over. Abigail stood frozen, staring at the engagement ring in Lucas's open palm as if she couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. But I could see it clearly. This was inevitable. She had built her entire world around a false sense of winning, but this wasn't a game. She wasn't the only player. Without another word, Lucas dropped the ring into the fountain. Then he turned and walked away. His family followed him, his groomsmen trailing behind. Finally, the last few guests filed out, leaving Abigail alone in the chaos. She stood there in her stolen dress, in her stolen wedding, with nothing left but the debris of her own choices, and me. I simply watched. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't taking action. It's letting people destroy themselves. As I walked away from the Magnolia estate, a quiet sense of peace washed over me. Abigail had tried to outshine me. She had stolen everything, but in the end, she hadn't taken anything at all, because you can't steal what was never truly yours. And as for me, I didn't lose anything. I just let go of something that was never worth holding on to. A year has passed since the wedding that never happened. A lot has changed. Abigail disappeared from our social circles almost overnight. She went from being the woman who had it all to the one no one wanted to associate with. At first, she tried to spin the story, telling people that Lucas had gotten cold feet, that the pressure of the wedding had been too much for him. But everyone knew the truth. They had seen the guest list. They had seen the empty chairs. They had seen her unravel in real time. And most importantly, they had seen me walk away with my dignity intact. A few months later, Lucas reached out. It was a late-night message, dripping with regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know you were right." I read it, a faint smile tugging at my lips. Then, I deleted it. Because closure doesn't come from an apology. Closure comes from knowing you never needed one in the first place. I heard from mutual friends that Abigail tried to rebuild her life, dating a wealthy older man, probably in an attempt to secure the future she could never steal. But it didn't last. People like Abigail always chase something they can't have. No amount of manipulation can make someone love you. No stolen venue, no stolen fiancé, no stolen wedding can grant you what isn't meant for you. She had it all for a brief moment, but now she had nothing. Looking back, I don't regret how it all unfolded. I never had to scream. I never had to fight. I never had to stoop to her level. All I did was stay silent and let her dig her own grave. Because the best revenge isn't destroying someone else's life. It's making sure they never had the power to ruin yours. And as for me, I walked away with everything I needed, my peace, my dignity, and a future infinitely brighter without them. Because while Abigail was still chasing after a fantasy, I was out there, living my reality. And trust me, it's far better than any stolen wedding could ever be.